Let's talk about primary and secondary sources. What are they, and how can you tell the difference? Primary sources are usually created during the time period that they describe. They represent a primary, first-hand account of an event. The difference between primary and secondary sources is where they gather their information. Primary sources are based mostly on observation, so examples of common primary sources would be breaking news articles or letters that a soldier writes home to his family that tell about his personal experience with war. Secondary sources, on the other hand, represent a second-hand account of an event, topic, or experience. While primary sources base the information that they provide on observation, secondary sources base the information that they provide primarily on accounts from other sources. Secondary sources may pull together primary sources like personal accounts and other secondary sources. Our first topic will be Benjamin Franklin. Primary sources related to Benjamin Franklin include things like the Pennsylvania Gazette, a newspaper published during Franklin's lifetime where he published many of his early writings and political cartoons. Primary sources would also include autobiographical works, like Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Franklin's correspondence with his friends and family, his personal letters, and personal accounts of events would also be considered primary sources. Secondary sources include historical accounts written by individuals who didn't experience them, like this biography written by a popular historian that gives an account of Franklin's life using multiple sources. Most historical journal articles also represent secondary sources. The second topic we're going to show examples from will be the Civil Rights Movement. In this case, I've chosen to focus on Dr. Martin Luther King's role in the Civil Rights Movement. Examples of primary sources related to Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement include, of course, Dr. King's autobiography. Letters and speeches are also primary sources, including letters and speeches that are meant to be made public. The I Have a Dream speech is a primary source. Additionally, the source pictured here, Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, is also a primary source. Additionally, newspapers reporting on a historical event as it is happening represent primary sources. In this case, we have the New York Times headline from when Dr. King was assassinated. Secondary sources include things like documentary films that include more than just original footage. So while an interview with Dr. King would be a primary source, a historical documentary that tells Dr. King's story and may incorporate interviews but also incorporates other sources would be a secondary source. Encyclopedia articles and reference sources are also examples of secondary sources. Here we have a short encyclopedia article on Martin Luther King Jr. from the Encyclopedia of American Studies. This short article is going to draw from multiple sources to present a very short biography of Dr. King. Additionally, books about a historical event, like this history of the Civil Rights Movement, would be considered secondary sources. Our next example is scientific research, and in this case, I've drawn the examples from agriculture. Scientific research is where primary and secondary sources look very different, but the idea behind them is really the same. Primary sources in the sciences draw conclusions from original research. Just like primary sources in history, they draw most of their information from direct observation. So, for example, an original scientific research article represents a primary source in science. Data gathered from an experiment also represents a primary source in the sciences. Secondary sources in the sciences draw conclusions from previous research. Secondary sources in the sciences include things like literature reviews that are going to look at the literature about a topic and make a conclusion based on what has already been written, as opposed to conducting their own experiment or study. Primary and secondary sources are not things that exist only in history class or in the sciences. They're also things that you encounter in your everyday life. Primary sources include breaking news headlines and videos from individuals who experienced an event. They can also include things like social media posts. So your Instagram or TikTok video is actually a primary source. Secondary sources that you encounter in your day-to-day life might include things like your textbook that you're using for class. Additionally, a secondary source that you probably have a lot of familiarity with is your research paper. Academic research papers are secondary sources. When you're drawing on all of those peer-reviewed articles and incorporating your own thoughts into your research and drawing on many different sources to present information about a topic, you are actually creating a secondary source. If you have any questions about what makes a source a primary source or a secondary source, or you need help distinguishing between the two, let us know. Moy Library is here to help you with all of your research needs.